The US and Ukraine say they've agreed to work on an updated and refined version of a peace plan drawn up by American and Russian officials. Following Sunday's talks in Geneva, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said more work is needed. European leaders have rallied behind Ukraine, seeking a better deal for Kyiv by creating and signing their own peace plan. But as those talks continue, so do Russia's attacks on Ukrainian civilians. Well, let's start with those red lines and discuss them with Yevheniia Kravchuk, who's a member of the Ukrainian Parliament for President Zelensky's Servant of the People Party. Welcome back to DW, Yevheniia. Maintaining Ukrainian sovereignty and securing a sustainable peace, is that a fair summation of Ukraine's red lines at this stage?
Well, first of all, I would like to comment on what Ukrainian people said. And obviously, it just shows how sensitive is the public opinion. No one trusts Russia. But I believe no one trusts Russia, not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe as such. Now, about the sovereignty. Well, what does sovereignty mean? It means to make independence, but also the possibility to make the decisions. So that's why our negotiation team so much fought on the point where we would not see the cap on Ukrainian army. Because people are distrustful to the long-lasting peace because they do not see a solid guarantees of non-repetition behind it so far. But obviously, we can reach these guarantees. And one of probably the most important guarantees for Ukrainians, it's own army and military production and the protection of the weapons that actually are deep strikes. Basically, having this safeguard that we can be dependent only on our production, not waiting for the partners to deliver. And of course, as you know, the very sensitive issues such as territorial matters, the Ukraine, NATO things are right now putting out of the bracket. So they are set aside for President Zelenskyy and President Trump to talk about and find the right wordings.
OK, so let's talk about what happened yesterday on Sunday. How would you characterize Sunday's talks in Geneva? Was that progress or was it damage control after the backlash to the initial US-Russia proposal?
Well, first of all, it is a very fragile process. We saw that these negotiations, they started in a very tense atmosphere, also because of all of these, discussions and leaks. But honestly, well, by the way, I also learned about these 28 points from the media because no official documents so far were presented to Ukrainian parliament. And obviously, because it is still work in progress, so we would see some more stable, or approved documents. So I think it is a good way forward. It's a good thing that United States are listening and hearing the arguments that Ukrainian side are putting on the table. But I think that the biggest challenge would be, again, to drag Russia to the table of negotiations. Because, Russia doesn't want peace. Russia wants a piece of Ukraine. And the larger, the better.
And you talked about the territorial concessions that had been leaked out of this document. Do you think Washington fully understands how dangerous Ukrainians view such concessions?
I don't think it's just Ukraine that views any of the territorial concessions as dangerous, because after 1945, after the Second World War, it is a crime to change borders of sovereign country by force. So, it's not about Ukraine. It's about the whole world order we built after 1945.
So what then do you think is behind President Trump's apparent eagerness to do deals with Russia about Ukraine without Ukraine at the table?
Well, first of all, deals without Ukraine will be not stable. And as we see from this joint statement of Ukrainian and American side, and that's a good sign, that we're seeking for the just and long-standing peace. So, of course,
please forgive me for interrupting you, but
Yes.
I just want to press you on this point. Why do you think President Trump appears so eager to do deals with Russia about your country without you being represented at those talks?
I cannot say that he's doing deals behind the back, because if that is would be the last and final point, we would not have these discussions in Geneva, and we would not have the communication. And it's also absolutely impossible to have these deals without Europe, especially if we talk about the future of the frozen Russian assets, of the whole security architecture, and so on and so forth. So, yes, everyone has to be at the table.
OK. The kinetic war appears to be frozen. Your army is tired and suffering from a desertion crisis. Your president is beset by a corruption scandal. And Ukraine's most important backer, the United States, appears to be trying to force you to accept Russian terms. Is victory slipping away from Ukraine?
If we would think this depressive way on the February 24th of 2022, we would not be a sovereign nation anymore. So, yes, it's difficult to fight a so-called second largest nation army in the world. But at the same time, the Ukrainian society is not ready to accept the peace that is basically capitulation. So right. I think we will have these difficult discussions, but at the end of the day, it has to be in the normal way if we really want to ensure the long-lasting peace.
Thank you for joining us again, Yevheniia. Yevheniia Kravchuk of President Zelensky's Servant of the People Party. Thank you. Well, Germany's Chancellor says he's not expecting a breakthrough on a peace deal for Ukraine this week. Friedrich Merz was speaking following consultations with European Union leaders on the sidelines of an EU-African Union summit in Angola. He says the process will be laborious, with only minor steps possible this week. Well, Ukraine's European allies have been pushing back on that original 28-point plan cooked up between US and Russian negotiators, which seemed to heavily favour Russia. Chancellor Merz said Ukraine's and Europe's interest had to be upheld.
Ukraine's interests are also Europe's common interests, and we want to safeguard them together in the long term. This means that Ukraine must not be forced to make unilateral territorial concessions. Ukraine must be able to defend itself effectively against aggression in the future, and to do so it needs strong armed forces and reliable security guarantees from its partners.
Well, joining me now is Nathalie Tocci, who is director of the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. Welcome to DW. Let's start with this.
Great being back with you.
Let's start with this plan, the original, and the steps that followed it, because we have the original US-Russia plan, which was never officially published. That's then heavily criticised by Europe. The Europeans then publish their counter-proposals, which then get discussed by US and Ukraine in Geneva. So what does that process tell us about Europe's ability to influence a search for peace in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I think essentially what we're seeing is that although the Russian plan transformed into a US plan, it, in a sense, made it look like Europeans were completely out of the show. The truth of the matter is that, particularly since Trump came in office, actually the role of Europeans has oddly increased rather than decreased. And what I mean by this is that prior to the Trump administration, the United States, as we know, used to provide a lot of military support for Ukraine. Now, the United States continues to provide crucial support as far as, for instance, intelligence is concerned. But as far as the broader military support, it is no longer support, because these are actually weapons which are bought by Europeans on behalf of the Ukrainians. So actually, Europe's role has increased over time. And what we're seeing is that regardless of what the Americans and the Russians may agree on, actually they don't have the power to impose their terms upon the Ukrainians, right? And they don't have the power to do so, partly because obviously the Ukrainians themselves have, to an extent, leverage, but also because Europeans support the Ukrainians. So, this is often the story which is told as one of European sidelining, European impotence. You can actually read exactly, the events of the last few days in the exact opposite light, I think.
Let me push back on that because, OK, more of the burden, a greater proportion of the burden has fallen onto European shoulders. They carry that burden, but they don't have the influence because ultimately this will be decided by the US deciding we are still interested and involved in this, or we're taking our bat and ball home and leaving you all to it.
Yeah, well, I actually think that second scenario is a fairly likely scenario. So, it seems to me that there are two scenarios emerging from all of this. So as a consequence of a Russian plan endorsed by the US, yes, maybe we don't quite know exactly what happened there, but let's say a Russian-US plan and a European-Ukrainian plan, one scenario is simply of a war continuing, right? So, and to be honest, I actually think that's the most likely scenario. And then the question is, are Europeans going to essentially go to Washington and say, look, President Trump, thank you so much for your efforts. You have been extremely generous with your time. But you know what? We can handle this. Just please, may you perhaps just simply continue supporting that intelligence support, which actually doesn't cost you much money at all. But for the rest of the issue, we'll take care of it. You can concentrate your ambitions to look for a Nobel Peace Prize elsewhere. And I actually think it's a fairly likely scenario that, confronted with a situation in which very clearly there is no ceasefire on the horizon, given not only the positions of the two parties, but the respective leverage of the two parties. As I said, these are not terms that can be imposed on the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians themselves, and President Zelenskyy made this very clear in his address to the nation a few days ago, if forced with the choice of dignity and giving up relations with their biggest ally, they would choose dignity, but they would choose dignity not simply as a suicide mission, yeah? They can choose dignity because actually they do have some cards to play, unlike what President Trump likes to think.
And it is Europe speaking, and by Europe I'm including the UK in this, is Europe speaking with one voice on a peace framework for Ukraine?
Well, if you look at these 24-point proposals, these have basically been endorsed by most European countries. And to be honest, it is the Europe that matters. Is this the European Union? No. Is this a broadly construed coalition of the willing, which, by the way, does not only include European countries, but includes a number of other key countries like the Canadians, like the Japanese, for example? Actually, that is a critical mass of European countries. Call it, as I said, a coalition of the willing, which are the ones that are already shouldering most of the responsibility on Ukraine, and I think will continue to do so, increasingly so, as Trump inevitably will disengage from this war because he cannot get the deal, in a sense, that he's after.
And of course, there's scepticism, which we heard voiced by Ukrainians in the clip just before you came on. They're giving their opinions on this plan. They don't trust Russia to stick to any deal that eventually gets negotiated with, which makes security guarantees, of course, that makes security guarantees so important. And is Europe matching its determined words with similar commitments to guaranteeing any future peace?
Well, look, I think firstly, and this is why the 28-point plan is a non-starter. The main reason why I think it's a non-starter has partly to do with the territorial concessions, but also, if not even mainly, to do with the halving of the Ukrainian army. Right? It is clear that Ukraine's first security guarantee is itself, right? Are its defense forces. And so that, I think, forget everything else, that is the one reason why this is not a plan that will ever see light of day, as is. Then, of course, you rightly say, well, what about the others? And another reason why, indeed, the Russian plan is a non-starter is that essentially it rules out any potential role of Europeans. And all the discussions that have taken place surrounding a reassurance force, have they been ambitious? Well, frankly speaking, I think they could have been a lot more ambitious. But is this better than nothing, particularly if we understand it as a complement to what the Ukrainian armed forces themselves would be doing? I actually think it's extremely important, not just militarily, but also politically. It's extremely important for Ukraine to understand politically that we understand that European security starts now. Of course, it doesn't end with Ukraine, but it certainly starts with Ukraine.
Good talking to you, Nathalie. Nathalie Tocci from the Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much.